mostly German techniques. And so this type of tool has actually been made the same way for hundreds and hundreds of years. So why don't I get started, and I'm going to explain things as I go, and then if you have questions later on, of course I'm going to put my safety glasses on now. We'll have some time for some questions and answers. So I'm going to go ahead and put the steel in the forge. It's going to take a moment to heat up. Using a gas forge, this is natural gas forced air. I designed and built these. This running at a little over 2,000 is great for general forging. It's going to take a moment to heat up. So as it does, I'd like to explain a little thing. People ask me sometimes, or they talk about wrought iron, and I wanted to clarify something. Wrought iron, of course, can be used to describe things that are forged, things that are hammered to shape, things, blacksmiths made things. But sometimes people use the term incorrectly, so I just wanted to touch on that for a moment. So as I mentioned, this is mild steel. It's not wrought iron. Originally, blacksmiths used wrought iron. Wrought iron is pure iron. It has no carbon. This is mild steel, a different category of steel. By the way, there's about 2,500 alloys of steel today, believe it or not, at least. And they're making more all the time. It's a whole science, metallurgy. So what is it? Mild steel is iron with 0.04 to 0.3% carbon. The higher the carbon content, generally the harder and possibly more brittle it becomes. So as you get, say, into tool steels, it might be 1% carbon, like say a file. If you get, say, into 2 to 4%, then we have what we call cast iron. It's very brittle. So carbon content definitely affects the material a lot. So now I'm going to go ahead and put my gloves on, and I'm going to start by making a taper. Now, I'm going to do a chisel taper to form the handle on this tool. So like it sounds, a chisel shape. And I could easily hammer that out by hand, but I think I'd like to use the power hammer that we have to make it a little faster. I have to work while this, literally, as the old saying goes, when the iron is hot, or mild steel in this case. So I'm going to take this over to the power hammer. So, I've made a chisel taper. It makes a nice looking ending for something like this, for a handle. Now back in the fire, the tool I used is called a power hammer. Like I mentioned, technically it's a self-contained pneumatic power hammer, which just means it's basically like a big compressor. It has a 7.5 horse motor. It's 60 kilograms, rated at 60 kilograms. So in other words, the hammer part that goes up and down is 60 kilograms, 132 pounds. So it's a massive sledgehammer, basically. It really is a great time saver. Now, steel is going to heat up much faster now that it's, I had a chance to get that first heat. We call it a heat every time the blacksmith puts the steel in the fire. I'm going to smooth out the taper now, and then I will start to shape the end. So out I go. I'm going to take my hammer, just kind of get rid of a few of those marks that the power hammer left. And then it's still plenty hot enough, so I'll start to round the tip over the edge of the anvil, and then the top of the anvil. Right about there, I like to stop at about a blood red color, dark red color, you could also call it. You generally, when blacksmithing, you don't want to hammer the steel or bend the steel a lot below a low red color. If you do, you risk cracking the steel. You also wouldn't want to heat above a yellow color, or you risk burning the steel. Exception being welding, which I'm going to do later. You do have to get it quite hot, almost white hot, a good yellow to white, but we'll talk about that later. So now that I've got the end of the handle formed, I want to form the handle itself. I don't want to undo the shape of the tip of that handle that I've already made. So what I'm going to do is cool that in water. So I'll quickly, I got a bucket of water here, just quench the tip. If it's cold, it won't lose its shape. Now I can shape the handle. So I'm going around the horn. I'll close that up. So I'm constantly checking both the shape I'm creating and often correcting for straightness. It's important to keep things straight as you go. It's much harder to correct something later on. So I keep it straight as I go. That's why I'm often stopping to check. That looks good. And I also notice this stuff forming on the steel and then it falls off on the anvil. Anvil dust, if you will. Technically, that's fire scale. It's a layer of burned steel. I'm burning gas, so in the forge, so as the steel is heating, the outside of the steel burns and flakes off. It's normal. In coal forges, solid fuel, scale generally a little bit different quality of fire scale. It's something subtle, something a blacksmith would notice. Now, as this is heating up, I'm going to heat a little larger section. Refer back to my sample piece. I'm going to put a twist in this steel. This is really something just to add a decorative element. It adds, you know, I would call it transition between the handle and the rein, or the tool and the tip. And it really shows how plastic the material becomes once it's heated to the right temperature. Okay. Now, almost there. I'd like to get a little longer heat per se, so I get a good twist. You need an even heat, long heat to get a nice even twist. So people often ask me when they're visiting, or students, you know, how many horseshoes I make. I've never made a horseshoe. There are blacksmiths. I have met blacksmiths who make horseshoes and decorative ironwork. And it, of course, used to be one of the mainstays of the blacksmith, especially in the colonial times when we had horses. A good part of the blacksmith's trade was to make horseshoes. Well, in about 1856, that's what, the car was invented. And since then, the trade of the making horseshoes and blacksmithing, doing decorative ironworker, they separated, and now the people who make horseshoes and take care of horses' health, we call farriers. And it's a very hard, back-breaking, and dangerous job, but there are still many people who do make horseshoes. Anyway, so now I've reached a good temperature. See how it's a good 2,000 degrees or so. I'm going to go over to the vise. And I'll go ahead and I'll clamp it about here, perpendicular to the vise. Then I'll take my twisting wrench. This is nothing more than an old box wrench that I welded a handle on. You can get these at, you can often find them used, rummage sales, antique stores. So look at how soft and plastic that material is. It always amazes me. Once you heat it up and get it red hot, or however you can do all kinds of shaping, twisting, that will not affect the strength of the steel at all. It will not weaken it. And what I'm doing now is I'm straightening the steel. I have found if you put it on its corners, a square, and you clamp, you can make a twist straight without deforming the twist. Now, usually that does the trick, but if it doesn't, I then have this handy wood mallet, which I think I'll go back to the anvil. It still has a, if the light was not as bright, you'd see still a faint glow in the steel. A wood mallet won't deform the steel. Just give it a little tweak to get that nice and straight. So if I were to hit that with the steel hammer, I would definitely okay, that's good enough. Well, one more tap. That would definitely mar the twist, which I didn't want to do. Just wanted to keep it crisp looking. And a little tap or two to tighten this handle up. So now I've got a handle. I've got a twist. I'm going to wipe the fire scale, the handle. If I don't, this stuff tends to, well, I didn't mention, it tends to get beaten into the steel, which I don't want. Now, I could turn this around. I'm going to work on the other end and hold this with tongs. It's often how we hold our steel, but since it's a long piece, I can quench this end in water, and then hopefully I can just hold it with my hand. Wearing gloves, of course. Now you might wonder why I'm wearing, actually I could hold it in my bare hand. The reason is, this is a welding, kind of a standard welding glove, better heat protection. I'm right-handed, so I'm usually holding things with this hand, so this protects my hand from heat. Often, in the past, I wouldn't wear a hand on my glove on my hand, on my forging hand, because I feel like I have a better grip on the hammer, a better feel. The handle doesn't slide and slip as easily. But you know, I've been forging. Another question people ask me sometimes is, well, how long have you been doing this? I've been forging since 1988. So over the years, I found all that wear and tear has taken its toll on my hands and my wrists. So a small, snug-fitting glove gives a little bit of cushion, helps absorb some of that shock, also prevents burns, and then the wristbands are really just to help support my wrists. Because all that vibration tears your wrists up, any repetitive motion like that. For blacksmiths, it's often the wrists and the hands. So I talked a little bit about the difference between iron and steel. Wrought iron, the pure iron I was talking about, is hard to find these days. If I go to any steel yard in the area, I wouldn't be able to find wrought iron. I think there's only one company that I know of that still makes it. And it's very expensive because it's made in small batches. It's usually made to use for historical applications, restoration. I have a cousin, Holger, in Germany, who actually was trained as he's a master smith. And so if he's going to, say, recreate hinges on a cathedral made in the 1500s, he's not going to use steel. he's going to use wrought iron because that was what we originally used. So that's often one reason wrought iron is used in one application. What happened was around 1886, Bessemer steel process was invented in Sheffield, England. It actually, if you, some of you might have kitchen knives or pocket knives that say Sheffield steel, it's still well recognized as a manufacturer of quality steel. Well, the Bessemer steel process is important because it made producing steel in mass quantities very cheap, very quickly. It very quickly outdid, it was so good and so cheap, it very quickly did away with wrought iron. Steel became widely available, much cheaper, and it's stronger, generally speaking, for most applications. So, now we're going to work on the tip. So, this is going to be the tip of my poker. I'm just going to make a gentle taper. A taper is a point, in this case, a blunt point. So I'm hammering on two sides. I'm letting the anvil do the work on the other two sides. Straighten things out. So, might be wondering about the anvils and the hammers. I really like, this has become my favorite anvil. This is actually happens to be a old, it's a Southern German, Austria, maybe Austrian pattern anvil. So there's a horn on this side, a horn on this side, but what I really like is besides that it has an extra table here, which becomes very useful. It makes it more useful for all kinds of different work. It has two holes, we call them Pritchell holes. A Pritchell was a punch, used to punch holes through hot steel. A Hardy hole is used to hold any Hardy tool. This is a Bic. And this is a hot cut Hardy, or a hot cut made to go in the Hardy hole. It also has an extra foot here where we can do real rough work, like say cutting through hot steel. Whereas this anvil happens to be a German pattern as well. It's a plain but two-horn double Bic anvil. Often the anvil that you think of, like the Acme Anvil Company, if you ever watched Bugs Bunny and Roadrunner, the classic anvil, that shape anvil, that's actually a London pattern. That's an English pattern anvil. There's actually many, many, many kinds of anvils, more than I have time to talk about. I have a London pattern that I use in my own shop that was made in Brooklyn, New York, believe it or not, around 1930, and it's still a hay-butted. Still works just amazingly well. It's hard to believe it was made by hand. Teams of people with sledgehammers. It was so labor intensive the trade died out. These are casts. Okay, so now steel's come up to top. What I'm going to do is bend the end over the edge of the anvil. So I'm going to go like this. And I'm going to fold the steel over on itself. Straightening things out a bit. Okay, so now let me show you something. So where it's folded over, I'm going to weld it and it will become this tip. If I don't weld it, it will probably just fall apart or split. So I'm actually going to use the fire to weld, so I'm going to turn the temperature up now. The target temperature for forge welding is about 2350 for this material. 2350 Fahrenheit, 24, around there. Now when I weld, I need to use some kind of flux. Anytime you weld, you solder, you braze, you use flux. What does flux do? Flux protects the surface of the metal so oxygen can't get in there and attack the metal, and allows the weld to take place. If you're soldering jewelry together, soldering two pieces of silver together, you use flux, different type, but it does actually some of the same ingredients as this. It coats the metal, prevents oxygen from getting in, and allows the solder to melt. The flux I'm using today, I made myself. I'd like to give Bill Fiorini credit for the recipe. It's the same stuff you can buy from a company called K&G. And I think it still says on their website, although I haven't bought anything since I make my own, for a long time it said, "Thanks for the recipe, Bill." And I just like to mention that because I studied with Bill. Bill Fiorini was my instructor and got me started in jewelry and blacksmithing. So what this is 4 parts borax and 1 part boric acid, pure, the technical grade. I just buy it from McMaster-Carr. Okay, I can see my forge is about 23. It's a temperature gauge on the side, about 2300, so it's starting to come up to temp, so I can prepare my material for welding. So I want to take a steel brush and brush off that excess fire scale. Clean it, basically. Want things clean and tight fitting when you weld. Now I'm going to do the welding right on this anvil because it's the closest to the heat source, the forge. Now I'll coat this with flux. A lot of it will melt. Well, it melts, but a lot will, as you just saw, fall off. You don't need an excess amount, so I kind of scrape the excess off. And what I like to do is put it in the forge with the faces facing up. In other words, not like this, but like this. And I'll put that in, and that is going to get very intense. If I do it, not only is the heat intense, the light is very intense. The UVA, UVB, so intense. If I do a lot of welding, I wear number 5 welding glasses. If you don't, you'll go blind. You'll get cataracts, you'll have all kinds of problems. It's really necessary. If you're glass blowing, you wear eye protection. If you're flame working, you use eye protection, that kind of thing. For one little weld, I'm going to skip that for now. Unless you want to grab mine from my little welding cart that's behind the screen. Maybe I should. Sometimes I skip it, but you know, it's really not smart because the more you do that, the more damage you do to your eyes. So excuse me. I should have had, thank you. I should have had these out earlier. So these are the number 5. Actually, I really should put them on, so I'll put them on. Besides being a good example, I don't want to go blind. I've only got 2 eyes, right? This is all by eye and feel now. What I'm looking at, if you were to look in there at the camera, you probably wouldn't see a lot except the bright light. But with the dark glasses, I can see that the flux is actually bubbling. It looks like it's boiling on the surface. Excellent. I'm reaching the point. I'm very close to welding. I'll get my hammer ready. Now I want to see that flux. What I like to look for with this particular flux is when I rotate the steel, it actually looks like the bubbles are running down the surface. Like, I like to describe it as like droplets of rain on a freshly waxed car. They just run, or they sheet. The sheeting action just rolls down the sides. Once that starts, that means that's your indicator that it's time to weld. And all I'm doing when I'm welding is hammering the materials together. Now some sparks are going to fly when I do this. Basically it's the flux being squirted out. Okay, that looks pretty good, so here we go. First weld. and stop. That fast. Material's already cooled down enough. It's not very thick. It's only 3/8 inch stock. So my initial weld is done. Now, I'm going to repeat that because I have found that why not do it twice just to make sure that I've got a really good weld. So I like to do that twice. I'm going to repeat this. It'll heat up faster this time. And my forge is definitely running hotter now, so that will help. Now, believe it or not, all welding, which was mostly wrought iron, I talked about, was done this way. You know, except they maybe were using coal. They used a lot of coal. They burned vast amounts of trees, unfortunately, to make charcoal for blacksmiths. It's still the preferred fuel for Japanese smiths who make swords, for instance. So often they were using solid fuel coal, charcoal, coke, but all welding was done like this. If you were on the first floor of the museum, a great example of that would be that Majorelle, a section of a Majorelle railing. It's just a masterpiece done around 1900 for the Paris Exposition. Every joint on that piece, if you look closely at it, was forge welded together. It's an incredible piece. So that's in the main collection of the museum. Okay, so looks good. We're ready for the second weld. Okay. I believe I've got a good weld. While it's still hot, I like to brush that flux off because it's kind of hard to remove. You know, it gets all over the place. Even if it's 90 degrees, I put full leather jacket, welding jacket. Might even put a bandana around my neck because the sparks will go down your shirt, which is no fun. Boots, everything, leather gloves, because those sparks will really get into places you don't want, like in the bottom of your shoe. That's no fun. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to stretch that weld out, that point, to create that point. So now back to the anvil I started at. Maybe I'll switch to a little bigger hammer, and then here we go. You know, whether you're using a gas forge or a solid fuel forge, you can do a lot of the same things, but of course, like a lot of things, each tool has certain advantages and disadvantages. Great thing about the gas forge is I've just stretched that to a point, the area that was welded. Great thing about the gas forge is you just turn it on and you go. You don't have to tend your fire. A lot of time is spent with solid fuel like coal, attending your fire, mixing water with the coal to create coke, getting rid of clinker, the residue, etc. If you don't watch it, you burn your steel in no time at all. Intensely hot. We have a little more control of the temperature of this, but we have a much longer heat. So you can saw my piece was starting to get kind of S-shaped at one point. You don't have as much of that problem in coal forge because you can control your heat and get a much shorter heat when needed. Now I could have used the power hammer for this, but it's already hot, so it does not take too long to do by hand. So I was going to mention the hammers because people are often curious about the types of hammers I'm using. So this is, I'm saying this word a lot today, this is a German style hammer. It's just because it happens to be the way it's trained and what I like. The German style crossbeam. I got these in several sizes. Leave that one there. And this is a Swedish crossbeam. Every country has a little bit different shape hammer as well as anvil, really. Okay, the thicker the stock, generally, the bigger the hammer. So at this point, actually, I can switch to a lighter hammer, make it easier on myself. Now, I'm going to start to form the end of this, or to bend one end over. Now it's starting to get a little cool there, so I better stop. It's lost that red glow. Now I want to open up this part. So what am I talking about? This is this part. So this barb, or poker section, so this is so you can pull firewood, and this is so you can push. So I need to pull this out, which is a little hard to do by hand with the hammer, so I'm going to actually take it back to the vise and use what we call a hot cut, not to cut it, but actually to pry it open. So here we go, going to the vise. And I left it over here, excuse me, there we go. So basically I'm using this just like a wedge kind of idea. Open that up. And then it looks like I've developed a very slight twist in the steel. The easiest way to get rid of that is to just put it back in the vise, use my twisting wrench, and straighten it out. Okay. This is called a leg vise, by the way, from the nickname from the leg that goes to the floor. It's made for blacksmiths, for forging steel. Okay, so I'm almost done. I need to shape the tips now. So I'm going to go back in the fire. So there's a little subtle thing I was doing, I don't know if you caught, but often I find if I forge a taper, it depends what kind of taper. If I just want a quick, fast taper, like the first tip, I do this on the rounded horn. It's my method. There's several ways to do it. The reason I like to do that is it's fast. This is round. The face of the hammer is slightly round, so it stretches the material same direction as the handle. So it naturally stretches the material into a point. For a blunt point, I often do it towards the back edge of the anvil. It's easier to reach, and I'm less likely, if I miss, to leave a ding in my anvil. Okay, so now for a little shaping. So I want a little more curvature this way, and then a little bit that way. So I think one of the beautiful things of doing things by hand, making things by hand, is each item that you make is going to be slightly different. So now I just have to kind of straighten things out, put a few tweaks in here, kind of clean it up basically. Going to take another heat to clean things up. So I could, for instance, make a jig, a tool to help replicate the same shape over and over. We've got drawers full of them over there. When making something like a fire tool, to do each one by hand, and then there's a little variation in them. Okay, let's see. I actually decided I don't like the way that looks, so I'm going to open that up a little. Okay, I think I'm going to leave it. I'm pretty happy with the shape. I'll just take a steel brush and to help clean it, remove the fire scale, I'll just brush it off. Makes it look a little nicer. Often when I make these, I might, when steel is cold, I might wire brush them with the power brush and then paint them. I'm not going to bother with that today. I'm going to just cool this off. Got a larger quench bucket over here, or barrel. So I can turn it around, brush the other side. Okay, there we have one fire tool. All made from one piece of 3/8 inch mild steel. Okay, so let me set this down and see if there's any questions. Okay.
You can let people know if they have any, they can type them in the comments.
Yeah, if you want, you can, you have a question or comment, you can type that in, and I'll take a look at that and get back to you on that later, if you come think of a question or a comment later. Thank you for watching my demo. I hope it was fun. I sure enjoyed it. I love blacksmithing. It's very fun. It's very physical. There's so much to learn. I've been doing this forever, and I still feel like I'm just learning just the tip of the iceberg. That's a wonderful thing about it. So thank you very much.